All right, so this is the first episode of a new series that I want to start. That will probably take me the entire duration of the channel. I probably won't even be able to finish this series by the time I end the channel, but my goal here is to touch on every possible topic that I can think of in the fitness industry. And obviously, I'll never be able to do that in the duration that I have this channel. So the series is so I can provide a few different topics in one video. I'll probably do these once a week or once every 2 weeks. And I want to give you some general advice on these topics as well as my thoughts on how they are within the community. So calling something underrated or overrated is definitely not the best way to go about things, but this isn't just going to be me saying something's underrated or overrated. I want to go a little bit more in depth, but also keep it compact and digestible. So it's a very nuanced conversation with everything in the fitness industry, but there's no way I'm going to be able to have a nuanced video on every single topic by the time I end the channel. So it's just not going to happen. Before I get into it, final stage of the mustache. It's pretty sad, and I think I'm going to have a hard time filming this video because I do have to see my reflection, but the purpose that this serves is much bigger than myself. It is something that Faz Lifts brought awareness to about men's health. So I think it's something that's very important. That's the reason why I'm participating. So stuff like this can bring awareness to mental health. And I think all of us, all the Noble Natty YouTubers have done a good job over the past month talking about this issue and bringing awareness to it. So with that being said, let's get into the video. The first variable to start this series off is going to be technique. And these are in no particular order. With technique, I'm going to say it's actually slightly underrated. I think the problem that we run into here is when we talk about technique, it's usually in terms of strength and how much weight we can put up in that given lift. It's always to optimize your strength output for that lift. And when we're talking about that in terms of strength, it's not necessarily the most productive for hypertrophy. Sometimes it can be counterproductive too. And when we're talking about technique and hypertrophy, a lot of the time it tends to devolve into a mind-muscle connection and pump thing. And that's definitely not the right way to look at technique for hypertrophy training. I'm not saying there's anything wrong, and I'm not saying that's the wrong way to look at your technique within your training, but technique is a lot more nuanced and a lot more important than a lot of us make it out to be. I think lifting with the right technique can be the difference between actually making gains from a lift and not making any gains from that lift whatsoever. Something as simple as a heel elevation on a squat can entirely change, and where you put the bar on your back. Stuff like this, these tiny little changes can entirely change what muscles are worked and what muscles aren't worked in a specific lift. Along with technique, obviously, technique encompasses a lot of different variables, but stuff like range of motion, length and position, the stretch, tempo, these things all make a huge difference, and I don't think technique is valued enough when it comes to programming. So technique, I'm going to have to say it's underrated. Variable number 2 is going to be volume. Volume has a few different definitions. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to go with the most popular way to view volume and the way that I view it myself, which is just the amount of sets you have in a given lift, workout, or in a given week or program. So when it comes to the total amount of sets you're doing, I actually think this is slightly overrated within the community. We talk a lot about volume, but at the end of the day, I think frequency, proximity to failure, and all these other of the major programming variables, volume is definitely important, and it's definitely something to be aware of. But once you have a base understanding of the general area of where you need to be at in terms of volume, there's not a whole ton else that you need to know from there, and I don't think it's quite as high as some of the other larger training variables. So volume's obviously very important, don't get me wrong here, but in terms of how much we talk about it and how much we care about it, I think we care about it a little bit more than we should, and I think we should put some of that energy into other major training variables like technique, proximity to failure, etc. Variable number 3 is going to be forearms, and I know this isn't necessarily a variable, but it is something that's related to lifting in some fashion, so I will sprinkle in some muscle groups here. Forearms, obviously, if you've been watching the channel, they're super underrated in my opinion. We never talk about how to train them properly. We even just calling them forearms is kind of ridiculous. That's like clumping your biceps and triceps into just arms, or your quads and your hamstrings into just legs. Like forearms are the same thing as your upper arm or your upper leg. There's two different muscles that both need to be trained equally, and I think that's just the way that we don't even talk about that, I think is proof that they're underrated. The problem with forearms is they're such an important muscle for your physique. It's basically along with calves, the only muscle that you're pretty much always having exposed. Same with neck, which is also, I'll leave my opinion on that for the next one. And we completely neglect the training of our forearms. And I think the biggest reason for that is because there's no big lifts associated with growing your forearms. So you're never going to see it be popular. You're never going to see it go viral. Stuff I've talked about before. But forearms, they're always going to be underrated. And I almost think that's a good thing, because that's like, it's like a secret weapon for those of you that can see past the big lifts and actually devote time to stretched wrist curls, reverse curls, finger curls, stuff like that. If you can kind of get your hands on that, you can level up your forearms like crazy, and you can take your physique to the next level when most people don't even train forearms. So it's almost like a little industry secret. Forearms are super underrated. Variable number 4 is going to be the entire platform of YouTube. This is a complex one because YouTube is huge and there's a bunch of different genres and subcultures of videos and communities on here. So obviously it's very complex. But I think in general, the analogy that I want to use for YouTube is going to be wanting to swim and going to swim, but you don't realize that you don't know how. What happens with so many people, and this is what happened with myself also, is swimming looks exciting, and that's like when you find the big YouTube channels that are ultimately not that good, but you just don't know. You keep watching their content, and it's cool and it's fun and exciting. It's like your first time swimming, but you don't know how to swim, and you don't realize that you don't know how to swim. And then eventually it just gets overwhelming and stressful because you're not actually learning anything new, and they're not teaching you anything, and you're just getting bored of it. And then eventually, in swimming, you just drown. But in YouTube, you would eventually just quit lifting because they've kind of ruined lifting and you still have no idea how to lift. And you sunk all these hours into lifting and watching these videos to ultimately be where you started. But if you do learn how to swim, aka you find the Noble Natties on YouTube and you get a breath of fresh air, now you can finally enjoy it. I think that's a funny analogy, and I think it makes a lot of sense. So I just wanted to say that one. YouTube is complex. I think in terms of comparison to other social media platforms, YouTube is actually wildly underrated. There's stuff like the channels, it's so insane because the best YouTube channels in terms of fitness have less than 100,000 followers. And you compare that to like the engagement on not only other big fitness channels on YouTube that don't have good content, but those big YouTube channels are small compared to Instagram, which is tiny compared to TikTok. So we don't even realize how small YouTube actually is. And that for that reason, I think it's just wildly underrated. And obviously YouTube's complex, so I'm not gonna be able to give my full thoughts in a couple minutes here. YouTube's very underrated. It's a powerful tool to actually teach you how to lift, and it has a lot of potential to truly change your entire lifting philosophy. And I think the reason why it's underrated is because it has that ability. You take other platforms like TikTok or Instagram, and these platforms have no benefit to you because you have no training fundamental mindset, you have no philosophy or program, and you have no idea what you're doing, and they're just throwing these random tidbits at you that mean nothing, that are all out of context. You end up just floating around, you make no actual progress, and it takes a platform that does long form content and incentivizes it like YouTube for you to actually build a fundamental knowledge and understanding of lifting and develop your own lifting philosophy through starting your own experience and actually making some progress. That allows you to then consume future content and have an opinion on it that isn't just a blindly following opinion. It allows you to think critically, and it teaches you that too, which I think is super important. And for that reason, I'm going to say YouTube is definitely underrated. Training variable number 5 is going to be the order of your exercises within your given workout. And I think this is actually pretty underrated. It's almost a given that every workout should be structured the exact same way. Every program you see is going to be squats followed by some type of hip hinge, then leg extension superset with hamstring curl, followed by calf raise, followed by ab work, followed by more calf work. And it's always a given that it's almost like we're ranking muscle groups, we're ranking lifts. And when you're training for hypertrophy, that doesn't make much sense at all. Obviously, there's certain ways you need to structure your training and your program. Like, you're not going to train stretched wrist curls before you do something like pull-ups trying to target your lats, because that obviously doesn't make sense. But pre-fatiguing, is something that we never talk about. Pre-exhaustion, never talk about it. It's always a given that we start with certain lifts and we work our way off of those. What ends up happening with this is either certain muscle groups entirely get neglected, very, very, very common, or certain lifts get entirely neglected. And it's usually the ones that actually help you in terms of bringing up your overall physique. The isolation lifts and those smaller, I don't even like that, like the big compound lift thing, I don't know, whatever. Those like smaller or less exciting or less flashy lifts that always get tagged on at the end of the workout, they either get half-assed or they get skipped. Very rarely do people actually start the workout off with bench press and take their tricep pushdowns just as seriously as they take their bench an hour and 45 minutes later. It's always either skipped entirely, half-assed, you cut a couple sets off. We don't put much thought or time into the order of our workouts. We don't think about it that much. I think it's super underrated, and it's clear that that's the case because everybody has big legs, big chest, but everybody has not everybody. But if the people that have lagging muscles, it's always the forearms, it's always the calves, the neck, the upper arms, rear delts. It's the muscles like this every time. Like I've never met someone and they're like, oh yeah, my quads are lagging, my chest is lagging. It's never the case. It's always arms, it's always forearms, it's always calves, neck, etc. And for that reason alone, I think it's safe to say that exercise order is a pretty underrated topic. Training variable number 6 is going to be supplements. And this is going to be a unique answer because I actually think that they are perfectly rated. I think they're right where they need to be. I think it's better to play it safe and talk primarily about the downsides of supplements than the upsides because the downsides are much more significant than the upsides you'll get from supplements. If we just kind of treated it as neutral, like, oh, whatever, it's a supplement, you can spend your money if you want, I think that would lead a lot of beginners and a lot of lifters that maybe don't realize that the supplements aren't doing anything to continue to spend money on these supplements that obviously aren't going to do much for you. And I think we're at the perfect sweet spot of debunking and talking down about supplements, but not going so far to where we start trashing things like creatine, protein powder, those normal supplements that can actually be convenient and help you out a little bit. So I think we're kind of in the sweet spot where we've talked about it. It's been known for long enough that supplements pretty much suck. There are very few people that think that supplements are this magic thing anymore. And I think we're at that sweet spot where everybody's making an informed decision and they know what they're getting into. And I think that's the best spot to be for supplements. And the last variable for today, number 7, this is going to be your overall enjoyment of your training. I do think this is pretty underrated. With training, there's a fine line between just doing things you enjoy and picking things that are hard just because they're hard. You have to find the sweet spot of both. You have to find a certain amount of lifts that actually work for you that target the muscles that you're trying to target. And you have to be able to find the variations, the rep range, the volume, the frequency that you like to work in that makes you want to go in and crush your workout. I think we all can find 1 or 2 lifts that we genuinely look forward to doing. And if we can maximize our time in the gym doing these lifts, that's going to be the most important thing. There's always going to be a few lifts that you don't want to do. Like if you just don't like doing rows, you're not going to find some magical row variation that you just love. You can probably find one that you don't hate, and that will probably be the best thing. But at the end of the day, you have to enjoy your training, because when you enjoy it, you're actually going to push it harder. You're going to look forward to going in to do your workouts. And when it comes to exercise selection, as long as your technique is good and your programming is good, there's not going to be a significant difference of picking a slightly suboptimal lift and executing it perfectly with the right intent and mindset than the most optimal lift, but executing it suboptimally, if that makes sense. So enjoyment of training, I do think is super important. I try and put at least 1 to 2 lifts in every workout that I genuinely look forward to doing. And I think it's always important to do that. Enjoyment is one of the first variables that I think of when it comes to lift rotations. If I have a new lift that I want to try, I set myself up to be able to incorporate that in because I know what my program is and I can look back at my training logs and my training history and I know exactly where that lift's going to fit in. So enjoyment of training is going to be key. If you don't enjoy a lift, the odds are that you are probably not going to be executing it as well as something that you do enjoy. So if you can find that sweet spot and find that balance between those two ends of the spectrum, and find that perfect spot where they meet in the middle to make your program the best you can, it's going to be pretty important. And I don't think that's something we talk about enough because it's individual to every person. There's not one lift that we all love. So it's not up to someone like myself or a content creator to decide how important that is. Ultimately, it comes down to you. And I think thinking about that is going to be important. And I do, for that reason, think that the topic of enjoying your training is pretty underrated. So that's going to be it for today. Please leave in the comments any other training variables that you want me to cover in the series moving forwards. And that's it for today. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.